And year in and year out, this should be more and more obvious. Sometimes it's week in or month in and month out. We're blasted with one constitutional crisis after another. But most of them that we see today are really just symptoms, or the most of them that they talk about today are really just symptoms of a much deeper constitutional crisis, one that has been going on continuously and getting worse for a long time, and one that obliterates foundational principles of the American Revolution. And in order to discuss that, I think we first need to understand a little bit about the American Revolution, not the war for independence that came after, but the revolution, the radical change in the viewpoints of the people that happened over a period of years. And for that, I want to start out with this great letter from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson when they were frenemies a little bit later in life, August 24th, 1815. And here's how Adams put it. What do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775 in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was drawn at Lexington. So the people had to have a change in the way that they viewed liberty, the way they viewed the power of government, the way that they viewed, well, sovereignty and the Constitution. These are things I'm going to get to in just a moment. Adams put it this way. The records of the 13 legislatures, the pamphlets, newspapers in all the colonies ought to be consulted during that period to ascertain the steps by which the public opinion was enlightened and informed concerning the authority of Parliament over the colonies. And what he's really getting to is the beginning of the Revolution, 1760, 1761. Adams often pointed to James Otis Jr.'s thunderous speech against the writs of assistance February 24th, 1761, as the beginning of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain. And here's I've got a couple of highlights. This part I don't normally cite, but he says, now one of the most essential branches of English liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle. We've all heard that phrase. We're pointing to James Otis, and maybe he got it from someone earlier. And while he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle. This writ, the writs of assistance, if it should be declared legal, would totally annihilate this privilege. This was about general warrants, about searching people's persons, houses, papers, effects, their property, without a warrant supported by oath based on probable cause. Otis continued. He said, custom house officers may enter our houses when they please. We are commanded to permit their entry. Their menial servants may enter, may break locks, bars, and everything in their way. And whether they break through malice or revenge, no man, no court can acquire. Bare suspicion without oath is sufficient. This is James Otis Jr., arguing against the writs of assistance in 1761. Now, if you're really just merely a subject, and this is really getting to what John Adams was talking about, if you're just a subject of any type of a government, it could be a king, it could be a queen, it could be an elective despotism, but whatever type of government, as long as government can determine that you are not secure in your own home and your own property, and they can come in and take your stuff and search your stuff whenever they want, well, then you're really just, you're just subject to the whims of government power. Now, here's Otis again. No acts of Parliament can establish such a writ. Though it should be made in the very words of the petition, it would be void. An act against the Constitution is void. So what he's saying is, well, there's something that's above the authority of government. All through history before that, governments in almost every situation held sovereignty or final authority. In theory, in principle, and in law, the British made this very, very clear. I've got some articles that cover that, but I'm not going to discuss that particularly today. But they made it very clear that they themselves held sovereignty, final authority, the king in Parliament. But here we're seeing a shift away from that viewpoint, that the people hold sovereignty, the people themselves are the source of power. And the Constitution, although Otis is talking about an unwritten Constitution for the British, it's the rules that the people have for their government. And it's not the government that gets to determine the extent of its own power because, as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison alluded to some years later, when you give government the power to determine the extent of their own power, you shouldn't be surprised that whatever limits you give them don't do anything, and that power grows and grows and grows and grows. Thomas Paine put it this way some years later: a constitution is not the act of a government, but of a people constituting a government. So the people are supposed to be at the top of the food chain. And I covered this in some detail on another episode, The Real Revolution, James Otis versus the Writs of Assistance, almost 2 years ago. I will link to it in the show notes. Now, not everybody agreed that the beginning of the controversy was 1761, because it didn't impact them in other colonies in the same way it did in New England, and especially in Massachusetts. Other people pointed to Patrick Henry, for example, and his arguments against, in his Virginia resolves, arguing against and opposing the Stamp Act of 1765. He was just 29 years of age, March 29, 1765, 11 days after he took his oath of office, and he took his oath seriously, unlike almost everyone today. They took the same view as Otis in many ways, that acts against the Constitution are void. Now, I don't often like citing Alexander Hamilton, but I have been quite often lately, because he had this great line in Federalist number 33 when arguing in favor of ratification, talking about the Supremacy Clause, and he pointed out that only acts that are in pursuance of the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. Anything outside of that are acts of usurpation, and he said, and they deserve to be treated as such. So if they're not a constitutional act, if it's void, like Otis happened to say some years earlier in 1761, and many founders and old revolutionaries repeated that over and over throughout the years, including Oliver Ellsworth, who was a Chief Justice for a while of the Supreme Court. If an act is void, well, what do? You don't follow it. You do what Hamilton said. You treat it as such. And Hamilton was really just reiterating some primary principles of the Revolution going back to Patrick Henry, because Patrick Henry didn't just specifically say that the act against the Constitution is void, but he pointed out that when it's void, you're not bound to obey it. And here's how he put it: the inhabitants of this colony are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatsoever designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them, other than the laws and ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. He's almost like the original 10th Amendment guy, because he's saying, well, if someone's going to make a decision about this, there's a line in the sand. The far-off government in London, you guys can make decisions on certain foreign policy, general issues for the empire, but all the things that affect the internal policies of the people of Virginia, well, those are only going to be done by the representatives of the people of Virginia. And when they do stuff that they're not authorized to do, it's void, and you are not bound to yield obedience. And this is any attempt to usurp a local authority. I covered Patrick Henry in some detail in an episode, Patrick Henry versus the Stamp Act. Of course, I will link to that as well in the show notes. Now, Thomas Jefferson discuss this type of thing as well in a letter to Henry Lee. We can debate the start. It doesn't really matter when the beginning of the revolution really counted, whether it was the Sugar Act or as James Otis Jr. or 1760, the end of the 7 Years' War, whether it was John Hancock not, resisting them customs officers on a ship, whether it was opposition to the Stamp Act. The revolution was really a broad and radical change in the principles of the people. And Thomas Jefferson said this about what he wrote in the Declaration of Independence. He said, the object of the Declaration, this is to Henry Lee in May of 1825, was not to find new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. So the common sense of the people around the relationship of the people and government, their ability, their right, their duty to alter and abolish, the list of grievances. This wasn't just Jefferson. This wasn't a committee of five. This wasn't the Second Continental Congress. This wasn't just the Lee Resolution or the Virginia Convention. This was Jefferson putting ink to paper to express the American mind, this viewpoint which was so radically different than how they viewed the structure of government under the British, which I'll get to in a moment, which we live under today, maybe even worse. Jefferson continued, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. All its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day. And I keep mentioning I'm going to link to this stuff in the show notes. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. After the live stream is done, 1 to 2 hours later, I try to get it earlier rather than later, but I've got some processing and stuff to do afterwards, and I set up the blog post, and I include all the links, and there's some WordPress stuff going on. But I publish that about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. On every single episode, you're going to find not just all the different platforms we're on. We live stream on the mainstream ones like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and LinkedIn. But we also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. I hope you check us out on some of these other platforms or the audio-only podcast edition. But for every episode like this one from Monday, No Deal for Gun Control, if my link opens up, interesting, you'll find a section that says show links. And I'm including almost all the stuff that I'm citing in the episode so you can read, listen, learn more in context on your own time. And while I'm here, I do want to say a quick hello and a huge thank you to everyone who's here in the live chat. I appreciate you here, whether you're live or in the archive, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. Lots of people: Tim Martin, Liberty Spike, Kirk Morrison, Cheriton Farmer, Ward Lawrence. Good to see you, buddy. Deep East Texas. Bastiat on lunch break. Thank you for joining us. Cheriton Farmer. Let's see who else here. Sparrow Dynamics. There's John, Alt Reality, King Nobody, Dave, White Bearded Gnu, Haji, and I know I always say this every time, Rick in Michigan, and everyone else. I appreciate you being here. I apologize for anyone that I miss. I will read through some comments a little bit later in the show or later today. I generally stick around while I'm doing that post-production stuff after the show. I generally stick around for 1 to 2 hours, so if you really want to engage with me as well, and I hadn't gotten back to any comments, a lot of times I will respond to comments in the archive on YouTube or Odyssey or Rumble within the first couple hours after the show is done. Anyways, we're talking about the real American Revolution, the origins of the revolution. It was a radical change of the viewpoint of the people. And here's how Mike Meharry put it in an article a few years ago. The American Revolution was a constitutional crisis. The British system of government during the colonial era was a constitutional system, but not in the same sense Americans think of today. It was an unwritten constitution. He said every act of Parliament was, well, I should read this other part. I don't want to read too much, but this is important. The Constitution was not written, and in the British system, no distinction existed between the Constitution or frame of government and the system of laws. They were one and the same. So in essence, if they pass something, it is part of the Constitution. So there was no restriction on what they could do. But James Otis Jr., of course, in 1761 is saying, well, you can only do certain things. Patrick Henry is saying the same type of thing. You can only do certain things. And when you do go beyond that, it's void. No one's bound to yield obedience to you. He got a little more aggressive than some of the other ones. That was the "if this be treason" speech where he was giving in front of that those resolutions. But going on, Mike says, every act of Parliament was, in essence, part of the Constitution. It was an absurdity to argue that an act of Parliament was unconstitutional, but they did it anyways. And that's why, well, we got treason calls for Patrick Henry. Since the government, since the king in Parliament was sovereign, sovereignty means final authority. Anything Parliament did was, by definition, constitutional. In fact, parliamentary acts became part of the constitutional structure. In many ways, I should just throw it out there, that's what we live under today. And I know I'm kind of getting ahead of where I wanted to be in my notes, but ultimately, that's the way people treat the government here in Washington, D.C. today. As soon as they do something, well, even if you argue it's unconstitutional, you treat it as constitutional in most situations until the government itself says, oh, sorry, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have been doing that in the first place. Or one part of the government lambasts another part of the government and stops them from doing things they shouldn't have been doing. So as long as people continue to treat it as constitutional by complying with it, then instead of taking the Patrick Henry approach and the response to the Stamp Act, then, well, that's what you get. Mike says, in effect, the British system operated based on a living, breathing constitution formed and defined by the government itself. It could change the laws as it needed to. It could change the limits of its own power as it needed to. And that's what we see with the Supreme Court, with Congress, with the executive branch today. And I think that's a really important thing. So when Otis said an act against the Constitution is void, this was a very radical position. This was a very radical change. And when Henry gave that speech against the Stamp Act, he was, of course, like I said, met with accusations of treason. We know the legend. We don't know if Wirt, when he wrote about this, the "if this be treason, make the most of it" is true, but it certainly is great for American lore one way or the other. I think there's some version of that probably happened. We don't know the exact words. Here's Meharry again. In the years leading up, he said, to the revolution. I think this is before we really did this kind of research. I would say in the years leading up to the War for Independence, Americans started, because we're using the word revolution and war for independence, the phrase war for independence, interchangeably. And I think we've improved our understanding of this over the years. In the years leading up to the War for Independence, Americans started to question this conception of political power. They began to think of a constitution as something that exists above the government, just like I was saying what Thomas Paine said. You know, a constitution creates the government, but the constitution is an act of the people. So if you're looking at the food chain, government is supposed to be at the bottom. It's unfortunately that people treat it as the top instead of the other way around. The colonist Mike Wright began to reject the idea that government formed the Constitution and instead conceived of the Constitution as something that binds government. In a very real sense, the War for Independence, Mike writes, was the result of this kind of a constitutional crisis. We see this also written by Samuel Adams, along with James Otis Jr., the Massachusetts Circular Letter in February of 1768, which was published or put together, drafted at the urging of John Dickinson. He wrote the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania against the hated Townshend Acts in late 1767, published them over a period of time, but sent all of them directly. I think he sent them, I don't know if he sent them to Adams or Otis, but he sent them to those guys and said, hey, do something with this stuff. If you guys do something in the Massachusetts legislature, in essence, this will help get the word out. Here's what they put. In all free states, the Constitution is fixed. The idea that government can change the limits of its own power as government determines means you're not in a state of freedom, period. The meaning of any constitutional structure, like any legal document, even though that wasn't written one at the time, means the same thing today as it meant the moment it was given legal force, as it was understood by the people who gave it legal force. Anything other than that is a living, breathing constitution, and a living, breathing constitution is in essence a dead one. It does nothing. Well, words on paper don't do anything, but it doesn't provide any structure. In all free states, the Constitution is fixed, and as the supreme legislative derives its power and authority from the Constitution, it cannot overleap the bounds of it without destroying its own foundation. It is an essential, unalterable right in nature, engrafted into the British Constitution as a fundamental law, and ever held sacred and irrevocable by the subjects within the realm, that what a man has honestly acquired is absolutely his own, which he may freely give, but cannot be taken from him without his consent. This is about self-ownership. This is about sovereignty. This is about final authority. This is about constitutions. This is about the nature of government, where power comes from. There's so much that's packed into this. Meharry continues. He says, it wasn't long before Americans began to question the very notion of sovereignty itself. It was an evolutionary process, to be sure, but eventually the colonists began to conceive of sovereignty residing in the people and not in any part of government. Instead of a monarch or legislative body, or a combination like the king and parliament, holding plenary power, that's basically they can do whatever they want, the people stood supreme. And that's how George Mason put it. All power was originally lodged in and consequently is derived from the people. Now, some people have asked me recently, I've gotten a couple of DMs basically saying, hey, dude, you've been covering a lot of this American Revolution stuff. What for? Well, we're ramping up to the time of commemorating the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So I think it's real. And also, at the end of this month is our anniversary. 17 years here at the 10th Amendment Center. And I think it's important to understand, well, it is absolutely, if you want to understand the work that we do, if you want to understand the problems we face today, how things are supposed to be, if you want to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution as well, you have to understand the principles that created that scenario. You have to understand the foundational principles behind it. So not only am I covering more of this during this show, we've got tons of articles and blogs and podcasts over the years where we've discussed this. And our email our email newsletter, which you can subscribe to over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/register. We've been sending out a lot of articles. You're basically getting, over the next month, a really amazing American revolutionary principle history lesson. We've covered Patrick Henry against the Stamp Act, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which were just passed on June 12th, 1776. Man, I get that right or wrong. We covered the Lexington and Concord. We're going to do a lot more, the Lee Resolution, etc. Anyways, George Mason, all power was originally lodged in and consequently is derived from the people. This was a radical view because if the king and parliament held sovereignty and final authority and anything that parliament did was part of, well, the Constitution, that totally is opposite of the view that Mason and the revolutionaries put it. So here's how Mike put it in another article, almost a decade old. My math is terrible. It's 2016. I went to government school, so you can forgive me for this. The American colonists fought a long, bloody war to free themselves from a tyrannical government. This was a government that claimed power over the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever. I know if you've listened to me talk, you're probably going to hear this over and over and over and over and over forever, that the revolution wasn't just, they didn't march on Lexington and Concord to collect taxes. They marched on them to collect, well, they did it for a gun confiscation, gun control program. But on top of it, this was an example, as John Hancock put it, it was just an example of the British claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever, the Declaratory Act of 1766. So as long as government has unlimited power, unlimited federal supremacy, maybe we could call it today, the federal law is supreme until the federal government tells us that the federal government shouldn't have been doing the things that the federal government has been doing all along. This is unlimited federal supremacy. This is federal law over the states and the people in all cases whatsoever, unless the feds say otherwise. There is very little difference. I mean, really, in practice, it's not different at all. Anyways, let's go back to this. I kind of get on these rants from time to time. Hope you enjoy it. The American colonists fought a long, bloody war to free themselves from a tyrannical government, only to see the people eventually embrace the very system they struggled to throw off. And that's my point there. If the British claimed the power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever, unless the British said, well, we made a mistake, or we're going to agree to your petition, or it's up to them. They have final authority. And then today we take the position that federal law is always supreme unless the federal government tells us that they did something wrong. There is really no difference. I mean, maybe because the Constitution is written, maybe some structural things, but in essence, as the way it plays out in practice, I see it as being the same. And Mike, I think, agrees with that. He says that may seem like a stinging indictment, but a careful examination of the U.S. system of government today reveals that it rests on essentially the same philosophical foundation as the 18th century British system that Americans rejected. And I think that's really, really important. We live in this situation where everything the feds do are supreme until the feds tell us otherwise. Mike goes on. In practice, the 18th century British system that the Americans went to war to free themselves from rested on a living, breathing constitution. The government itself defined and enforced whatever limits it might have. Essentially, it was unlimited in power and authority. And today we live in a society where the vast majority of people believe that the Constitution means what the Supreme Court tells us it means until the Supreme Court changes its mind. This is basically what Thomas Jefferson said. If you believe that to be the case, you're creating a despotism of an oligarchy. You basically have, well, 9, but really 5 unelected, unaccountable, politically connected lawyers that love the system making decisions for 300 plus million people that are supposed to last for all time until maybe a few decades later they change it around. Oh, sorry, we made a mistake. In reality, the Constitution is supposed to mean what the Constitution means, what the ratifiers understood it to mean, and that never changes over time. It's up to the people, if they don't like it, to make changes through the amendment process, but that's a different story. Anyways, I covered this in, here, a little bit more from Mike. He said, even a casual look at American governance today reveals the system has more in common with the 18th century British model than the one the founding generation forged nearly 250 years ago. America operates under a living, breathing constitution with the U.S. Supreme Court taking on the role of sovereign. So if the Supreme Court gets to determine what the Constitution means, then the Supreme Court is sovereign. They're basically our oligarchs, our king in parliament today. And that's not what a free people does. Thomas Jefferson, of course, told us that a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. So if we want to be free, we have to recognize that we have to learn how to exercise our rights, whether the government wants us to or not. And as I was mentioning, I covered this in another episode. All this stuff is going to be linked to in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. The real American Revolution was a radical change in the views of the people, and it happened years before the War for Independence. Some of the main underlying principles are also essential for a radical change in the views of the people today. So they fought a long, bloody war. They had this long 15-year revolution in thought. It resulted in a war for independence because they came to do gun confiscation, and eventually the people said, enough is enough. Here's the line in the sand. You're basically trying to totally subject us to total despotism and tyranny, and that really pushed enough people over the line in Lexington, Concord, and elsewhere. And it didn't take long for the people to kind of slowly go back to exactly the same type of system of then. And Benjamin Franklin warned us about this on September 17, 1787. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but in essence, he said, you guys know I'm not in favor of everything here in the Constitution, but I think we should ratify it because it's the best we're going to get. And as long as it's administered well, we're going to have some freedom. It's going to be good. But over time, that's not how it's going to play out, because this can only end in despotism, is what Benjamin Franklin said. When the people become so corrupt, that's the only government that they can really deserve or want or get. So he said it can only end in despotism, because he predicted that human nature would lead to what we have today. Maybe not the exact thing, but the end result certainly the same. Here's how Richard Henry Lee put it in a letter to Samuel Adams on October 5th, 1787. The people, he said, had not fought the British only to be brought under despotic rule, under the notion of strong government, or in the form of elective despotism. So I think the real constitutional crisis that we face is that the people don't treat themselves as the source of all power. And if they do, they're using it for consolidation, strong centralized government. They're begging, demanding for more government power over various areas of everyone's lives, not just their own. They want to control everyone else. So I think in many ways, this is the real constitutional crisis we face. And until, as Samuel Adams told us, all might be free, he said, when they value freedom and defend it as they ought. Until we have that mentality on a huge scale by the general population, I think things are only going to get worse. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. If you want to help us get this kind of message out to more people, nothing helps us get this job done more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. We're going into year 17. We are really on a shoestring budget. You would not believe how much we squeeze out of that dirty government fiat. So if you got a couple of bucks you want to throw our way, you got to, no pressure, but really we could use the support over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Membership program starts out at $2 a month. We also have annual, lifetime, 5-year options. Tons of different payment options, whatever you want to use, and we really appreciate any consideration you can give to joining us today. Let me take a look over in the live chat and see if there's any comments or questions. A little back and forth here. Mason, Hamilton. I'm not sure if there's seeing anything that I can special. Rick in Michigan says rants for the win. Yeah, I like that. So really, I do some side rambling from time to time, and I guess that makes the show go a little bit longer than what I expect. I'll read through these comments and questions a little bit later. I'm not really seeing any direct questions. Bastiat points out Dickinson, Hancock, Jefferson, Madison, the ones who matter. I think everyone matters. Every human being matters. And if you're talking about revolutionary principles, we have to, as Adams was telling us, you have to look through all the historical documents and actions of the time. Joseph Warren, the Suffolk Resolves of 1774, which called for disobedience to courts, defiance to the coercive acts. Even tax resistance is far more aggressive than what anybody calls for today. But of course, that's not something that's taught much anywhere, except here on the Path to Liberty podcast or over at 10thamendmentcenter.com. I really appreciate you guys being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think. And I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty. Thank you and have a great day.